Hey everyone, this is the Consummate Shill, and what I have for you today is a fundamental look into the good, the bad, and everything in between in the early access version of Iratus, Lord of the Dead.
Time to harvest.
I'm just going to dive right into the meat and potatoes with this review, since I went over the very basics of the game in a preview video I made recently. I'll be sure to add a link to that video at the top of the screen if you'd like to go over some of the important information pertaining to the story, comparisons to other games, and some initial thoughts and conclusions on the basics of the mechanics. I definitely recommend watching that video before proceeding with this one, but it's not a prerequisite to understand this review by any means. And just as a side note before we get started, as of August 13th, 2019, they're still running advertisements for their other titles on the main menu of a $25 game. First off, I think a structural outline of how the game works is always beneficial for those who may be unfamiliar with these types of games. When you begin a run, you're dropped directly into the home menu of the game and allotted a modest selection of 4 minions to begin with, and as far as I can tell, you're always given the same 4. You also receive a few minion parts, items, and artifacts in varying amounts depending on the difficulty selected. You can begin right out of the gate by upgrading the starting minions with your parts or creating additional minions. Beyond that, there's not much left to do other than to dive right into the first level. A playthrough will consist of 5 levels, starting with the mines. After fighting through the mines and defeating the boss at the end, you move on to the dwarven tunnels, and then through the mercenary barracks. After finishing the boss of the barracks, that's where your early access experience will end. There's going to be 2 more levels beyond that, which are both labeled available after release. Now, I can surmise the last 2 levels will take place on the surface, judging by the cutscene after the barracks boss. And on a very elementary level, that's really all there is to a game like this. You run through all the levels and finish the game any way you see fit. Now, the replay value in a game like this comes with doing the aforementioned in different and creative ways, and really tailoring your party compositions and combat methods to your liking, and hopefully figuring out new and innovative ways to progress through the game. In this game, and the others that have come before it, party structure is paramount, and how you choose to use the parties you create can be a very complex and rewarding experience. Just a quick note, the devs advertised the game as a roguelike. You could call it maybe a roguelike-like, I guess. The only aspects of the game you could consider roguelike are the procedurally generated levels, and the ability to retain your minion unlocks through subsequent playthroughs. Now, to understand how the minions, items, parts, and artifacts work, you have to understand what the statistics do. The majority are self-explanatory, so I'll just do a quick rundown. Attack affects the damage of physical and magical attacks. Dread affects the damage of stress attacks. Accuracy affects your chance to hit enemies with any attack, minus that enemy's evasion. Evasion increases your chance to dodge attacks, and luck is your % chance to score a critical hit with any attack. Armor and resistance reduce physical and magical damage respectively at a flat rate of 1-to-1. Blocks and wards flat out block any physical or magical attack respectively. And this game is divided into attacking rounds, so initiative determines when you will act in a given round. The characters with the highest initiative act first. Wrath and mana are resource pools that you utilize in battle. Minions spend Wrath for their more powerful skills, and Iratus himself spends mana for his spells you acquire through talents and some artifacts. More on artifacts and talents later. The parts used to create your minions can be upgraded, and the more you upgrade them, the more stats they'll gain. Each minion takes 4 parts to create, all with varying recipes consisting of the 10 different parts in the game. You can upgrade, convert to other parts, or transmute these parts into items at the alchemy bench at your management screen. Each minion also has 2 item slots. You can acquire these items through battle or create them with alchemy like I just mentioned. One big gripe I have with this game is that the stats on the parts vary widely between upgrades. The rarities are gray, which is common, green, uncommon, blue, rare, and purple, legendary. The legendary items are so superior to the other rarities that it feels worthless to equip anything but the legendaries. It takes 2 parts of the same rarity to upgrade to the next rarity, and each time you upgrade the parts, they gain random stats within that part's particular stat pool. The problem is when you equip a part, you can no longer upgrade it. Once you equip it, that's it. And parts aren't necessarily scarce, but they're scarce enough that it feels horrible to equip anything but a legendary part. Now, maybe this will change for me when the game is extended by 2 entire levels and you have more time to upgrade, but I think this whole system kind of needs adjusted because it's basically pointless to equip anything less than a purple part, in my opinion anyway. The items also vary in stats and rarity, and they too are locked once you equip them, but that system feels fine overall, I think. I should mention that even though a part or item gets locked once it's equipped, it can be overwritten. The last type of lootable items are artifacts. These artifacts are equipped by Iratus directly and have various effects on your minions or enemies varying from giving your minions increased armor or a chance to drop extra minion parts at the end of a fight, all the way to interesting effects such as the Maddening Amulet, which gives the enemy a chance to go insane at only 85% or less sanity. I'll touch on this artifact again here in a bit with the skeleton minion. I need to briefly touch on stress. The stress mechanic itself is pretty simple. Enemies have a set amount of sanity, and when they get to a certain threshold, I think it's around 50%, they can go insane, causing a variety of detrimental debuffs. They also have a chance to become inspired, however, and gain some very good buffs that can backfire on you. There is an artifact, though, that prevents enemies from becoming inspired, which I use almost exclusively in that slot. Receiving any amount of stress damage while at 0 sanity can cause a heart attack and immediate death.
Brave are an excellent source of fresh corpses.
Enemies in the last position on the battlefield are subject to fleeing when at low sanity levels. Sanity and stress damage are very interesting, but interesting as they may be, stress damage can be very volatile and unreliable at times. I've seen some enemies take stress damage while at 0 sanity 5 or 6 times in a row and not die, which can be very problematic if you're running a stress party. This doesn't happen often, but it can be catastrophic if it does. Now on to the foundation of what makes these types of games so interesting. The 17, as of the time of recording anyway, 17 playable characters. These characters are Iratus' minions, and you unlock subsequent minions by completing various different achievements during your runs. It's sort of a milestone system. For example, you unlock one of the minions by killing X amount of enemies, another is unlocked by eliminating Y number of enemies with stress attacks, and so on and so forth. I'm going to divide these up into 3 categories. The ones I haven't unlocked due to more extensive achievement requirements, the minions I've unlocked but didn't interest me enough to use all that often, and the ones I've played to an extent that I'm comfortable elaborating on them. Now of the 17, I don't have any experience whatsoever with 4 of them, those being the Ghoul, Vampire, Bone Golem, and the Infested. I had just unlocked the Bone Golem right at the end of my last run, but was too invested at that point to fire up another minion. After a little reading before this review, I also discovered the Vampire was a relatively easy unlock that I just didn't understand how to complete while I was playing. The Ghoul required you to do a lot of damage to your own party to unlock, and I'd never really adopted that playstyle, so I missed out on her. And finally, the Crown Jewel, the Infested. And in order to unlock the Infested, you have to either reach into your wallet for an extra $8.24 at the time of purchase for a total of $33.23, or purchase the Supporter Pack DLC afterwards for an additional $10. That's right, folks. They have a playable character and a progressive dungeon crawler locked behind an extra f***ing paywall. Included in the Supporter Pack is a soundtrack, 8 skins for your minions, an art book, a strategy guide, and they say a few more items are going to be added throughout early access. Now, I'm all for supporting a developer if you like the work they're doing, and you want to toss them a little extra for some swag or skins or whatever, but locking playable content behind dollars and cents gets you a one-way ticket to f***ing Turd Town in my book. Furthermore, I think that the list of content, sans the minion, would have been a fine supporter pack for the players that were really into the game. So with that rant out of the way, the minions that never really worked for me. The Wraith is sort of a jack of all trades with magic and stress direct damage, and skills that buff and debuff evasion. He seems pretty weak in the earlier levels compared to the starting minions, and I never really worked him into any teams. The Shade and the Lost Soul are probably my least used minions. The Shade is largely based around large magic nukes with some accuracy and evasion utility. He does have a skill called Pain Reflection that seems really interesting, which reflects the damage the entire party takes as stress damage. But again, I never really found a place for him in my parties. The way I rationalize skipping over that skill in particular is if I'm taking damage, it's almost always a bad thing. So in order for the stress damage reflection to matter, you're going to have to be taking a decent amount of damage, and that never sounded like a great plan to me. And I'm just completely, for lack of a better term, lost when it comes to the Lost Soul. Her magic and stress damaging skills are pretty good, but they come with the caveat of buffing the enemy in various ways. You could synergize these skills with other minions that attack when enemies receive buffs, but they're not exactly insignificant buffs. The Misleading Beauty skill does good magic damage, but gives the enemy a 15% damage buff. Now, Harath's skill does remove all buffs and debuffs from the enemy, and gives your party +1 damage for each one removed, but the amount of time it takes to set this up to make a meaningful damage gain just isn't worth the extra damage you're going to take in the meantime. She also has a heal, which to my knowledge is the only targetable heal in the game, but on her next turn she does magic damage to the person she healed. You can give that minion a ward before the heal, but if that ward gets knocked off by an enemy, you're going to nuke your own teammate and negate the heal unless that teammate has some pretty high magic resistance. The Lost Soul just needs a very specific team built around her to utilize her kit properly, and I just never landed on any ideas that seemed usable. And last but not least, the Blood Phantasm. Out of the four, she seemed like she could be the most useful, but the main skill I was interested in wouldn't work on the skeleton, which was a real issue for me because I ran the skeleton ragged. Mark of Retribution works like a taunt that reflects a flat amount of damage back to attackers. The skeleton is immune to the mark, but it was functional on the Death Knight, so I tried going that route. The taunt mechanism on that skill just isn't reliable enough though, and it was oftentimes a wasted action. Her kit also includes various physical and magical attacks, with a Wrath ability that double strikes with half physical, half stress damage. And overall, she has a really unique kit, but much like the Blood Golem, I acquired her so late in my gameplay I couldn't figure out an effective way to utilize her. And now for the minions that I used extensively. The skeleton. I could go on for another video's worth of time on why I like this minion so much, but in short, he just fits in practically any style of party that I created. He has high base health and initiative, a physical attack that ignores armor and block, a physical double strike that when upgraded you get extra attacks based on enemy buffs, a wrath skill that does a large amount of stress damage to all enemies, and a reliable taunt that gives him armor, resistance, and can reflect stress damage. His stress-reflecting taunt is so fucking good when combined with the maddening amulet artifact. It's hard to grasp how good it is until you see every enemy go insane within the first 2 rounds of combat. He fits on big nuking damage groups with his ability to protect the party and easily induce insanity. He fits in stress damage groups with that as well, plus the added ability to do big AoE stress damage. And he fits on balanced parties due to his versatile kit. He's a very well-designed minion and saved my ass multiple times. I made some mistakes and my party was reduced to the skeleton in a 1v4 and he made it out of that fight by chain taunting and reflecting stress damage. It can't be overstated how insane this minion is. The zombie, which I touched on in my preview video, is great in the right situation, but those are pretty specific situations when pure damage is needed and you can forego a minion with any type of utility. He's tanky and great for blowing shit up, but beyond that, you just don't get much, and his accuracy leaves a lot to be desired. He has his 4-shot machine gun cannon skill, which I absolutely love, and a wrath skill that's a cannon blast that does big single-target physical damage. His other skills, however, pale in comparison to these two in damage, and his only real weakness would be enemies with higher armor, as the 4-shot cannon skill does a lot of total damage, but when it's split between 4 smaller shots, armor can soak up most of that damage, if not all of it, with each individual shot. Now, the Bride of Iratus. She's one of, if not the best minion in the game. She has single target and physical magical attacks that do big damage, especially if they crit, as she has relatively high innate crit chance. She also has a stress attack that shifts the enemy back 1 position, and more on that when we get to the Lich minion. The Rose for a Lady is her wrath skill, and it's a wrath skill I utilized the most by far next to the skeleton's AoE stress skill. This one fires an arrow, hitting every enemy and guaranteeing all 4 hits to be critical. On top of that, you can upgrade the skill to do 200% increased damage on criticals instead of the default 100%. For me though, what makes her so damn good is her extremely high base accuracy rating, which is far and away the most of any minion. It makes her damage so reliable, she rarely ever misses unless the enemy has a huge evasion buff. She also has very high initiative, so she's getting kill shots before your enemies take their subsequent turns. The Bride is another minion that you can just plug into almost any party configuration due to her versatility and accuracy. And speaking of the Lich, I'll just jump to him. This guy is the stress team extraordinaire with his poison clouds. He casts a cloud on an enemy position that lasts 2 rounds and does stress damage to any enemy that enters that position. You can get 2 clouds on the board, and if you run 2 Liches, you can get that up to a cloud on every position. When you combine this with position-altering skills like the Bride's stress attack, coupled with enemies who may use skills that change the position they're on their own, you can absolutely melt the sanity off an entire party in a couple turns, and watch them all croak in a cardiac symphony. It's truly a thing of beauty when you get it going. The Lich also has some oddball stuff, like he can execute an ally to heal the rest of the party, he can summon skeletons at a very high cost of wrath. I haven't messed around too much with the latter 2 skills because neither starting the party with less than 4 minions or killing a minion off on purpose ever sounded like a very good idea to me. You know, there could be some interesting tactics with that though. The Banshee and the Mummy were probably used the least out of these minions that I liked, but it's not necessarily because I couldn't find a use for them. Either one will mesh well with the stress party, especially the Banshee, and the Mummy's no slouch in an attack party either. Specifically, the Banshee has an AoE stress attack that does a modest amount of stress damage, but she also debuffs the attack stat of any enemy affected by it by up to 6, which is maybe the best attack debuff in the game, and you can hit all enemies with it in one shot. This especially synergizes well with the Dark Knight's stance skill, which can be upgraded and does stress damage to any enemy affected by a debuff. The Banshee has various other stress abilities, and her Wrath skill stuns both enemies in the 1 and 2 position, which that can be very useful as well. The Mummy has a stress damage over time skill and a team-wide debuff removal, which situationally can be very nice. He also has a Wrap ability, which does a respectable amount of physical damage and yanks whatever target it hits to the front of the pack. That ability causes massive disruption for the enemy party. His Wrath skill also does a huge amount of stress damage, as well as 1 extra damage for each point of negative luck the enemy has. Attacking the Mummy reduces the luck of the enemy by 10 each time, so it can stack up very quickly. It's by far the highest stress damage ability in the game. The Dark Knight is a good all-around character with very high defense and good stress damage. His physical damage is somewhat lacking, but he can still bring it with the right party. His synergy with the Banshee is almost on par with the Lich Bride of Iratus stress gimmick I discussed earlier. His Wrath skill cannot be evaded or blocked, and does either modest flat AoE damage or massive single target damage, and he restores the total amount of damage done as health. He's practically unkillable if you leave a little Wrath for him to use. He also has an ability that removes all debuffs from himself and restores mana to Iratus. If you're ever at a loss for your last party member, just throw him or the skeleton on the front line and dive into the fight. Now, the Headhunter. He gets his name honestly. He suffers from the same accuracy woes as the zombie, and for good reason. This guy is like a methed up kamikaze pilot. Most all of his abilities do an absolutely ludicrous amount of damage, and he can do that damage from any position. Most of them involve hitting a random selected enemy for massive single target damage. If you can get his accuracy up through parts and items, he turns into an unstoppable force. He does have one skill that can't be evaded, ignores block, and does a modest amount of damage while removing all of the enemy's armor and resistance permanently, which is through the roof valuable against armored opponents. His very high cost Wrath skill is truly insane though. It ignores block, does an ass-blasting 200% physical damage, which is the highest damage ability in the game as far as I'm aware, and when upgraded has a 99% chance just to outright kill an enemy instantly no matter the damage you do. Boss is excluded from that, of course. All of these absurd skills turn him into sort of a gambling man's portable executioner. If you fail to get him going and miss several attacks in a row, you can get yourself into trouble. But if you get on a hot streak, you can just enjoy watching the heads roll. And if all of that wasn't enough, he has a stress attack on par with the Dark Knights that also uses random targeting. And finally, the last minion, the Fallen Dampier, who I didn't technically unlock, but I had 2 of them as minions during a run. To unlock the Dampier, you have to isolate her in battle, get her to low health, then you collect her as a mission reward. You need to collect 3 to unlock her for creation, and I have 1 left to collect yet. Anyway, the Dampier has high innate luck, a physical damage leeching ability, and 2 very valuable low-cost Wrath abilities. One is a multi-strike physical damage attack that reduces armor to 0 permanently, and the other is a replica magic attack that reduces resistances to 0 permanently. She's very useful in a damage party when you know your enemies will have high amounts of armor and or resistance. Put her alongside a Headhunter and a Bride and you'll have a death squad. Now that was a lot of time spent discussing the minions, but I feel like I would be doing you all a disservice by glossing over the most important and dynamic part of the game's entire structure. Appreciating the complexity of the minions and possible synergies between them allows you to see how deep the game can become if you're creative enough. Now on to talents, because I've mentioned them enough times without any elaboration by now. You start with 1, 2, or 3 talent points depending on the chosen difficulty, and gain another one every time Iratus himself levels up. Tier 1 talents cost 1 point, Tier 2 cost 2 points, and so on. I tended to use the alchemy tree the most for extra parts, artifacts, brains, etc. Oh yeah, brains are lootable items that raise the level of a minion to a set value of the brain. You can create a minion hot off the press and use a brain to level them up to the level of the respective brain immediately. They really save you in a pinch if you lose a few minions or have a party wipe. As far as the other talents go, I didn't delve too deep into magic, ire, or destruction trees because the benefits of receiving all the extra loot from alchemy seem to far outweigh going deeper elsewhere. You also have a graveyard, which is akin to the Darkest Dungeon Hamlet. You essentially sacrifice a minion and spend Architect's Souls, which are another lootable resource, to build each building. Once the building is built, you can place minions of any level in these buildings to work in them while your party is off in dungeons. The more minions you have working in a building, the more effective that building's rewards become. There's an obelisk, which generates more Architect's Souls, which I found largely useless because you receive plenty from battles. The library, which gives Iratus experience. The Dead Lake, which gives you a low chance to discover an item. Excavation gives you random parts. The Iratus statue restores mana. The arena allows minions placed there to gain experience. The mortuary is a necessity to heal your minions. And the Abode of Wrath, which aside from the mortuary is the best building by far in my opinion. You get 12 Wrath at the beginning of a battle for each minion working there. Starting a battle with an extra 48 Wrath is insane and can allow you to get ahead early in fights. As far as difficulty goes, there's 3 different settings in the game. The first one is Cakewalk, which, if you're not a fan of the genre and you haven't played a lot of these games before, that's probably going to be like your normal setting. However, if you're familiar with this kind of game, that'll end up being sort of an easy setting for you. Now, the next setting is More Pain, and it's a significant ramp up in difficulty beyond Cakewalk. And this will be hard for your average player who's not too familiar with the genre. And if you are familiar with these games, this will be sort of your normal setting. Now, the Good Always Wins setting, it ramps difficulty up pretty significantly, and even for experienced players, this is going to present a challenge to you. And if you're new to these kind of games, I would not even... Well, I mean, at this point, you'll have completed More Pain to be able to unlock Good Always Wins. So, you know, give it a shot if you've done so, but you're not even going to be wanting to touch this difficulty if you're not familiar with these types of games. And the last feature that I haven't talked about yet is the Humanarium. It's a codex full of information about your enemies, but the catch is you have to collect the enemy's card by defeating them in battle. And it appears to be a random chance to get this card, because I'm positive I've killed several of a certain type of enemy, and I still haven't received their Humanarium card yet. I could be mistaken here, but I'm almost sure this is the case. But anyway, the Humanarium contains vital information about how your enemies behave. If you found yourself getting your ass handed to you by certain types of enemies, give the card a quick read in there, and you'll be surprised what you learn. Now, before I wrap this up, I want to discuss bugs, or the lack thereof in this game. Now, this may be hard to believe, but I haven't run into a single bug in this game, big or small. If I did encounter a bug of any kind, I didn't notice it. There were a few times where I forgot that Headhunter skills are all randomly targeted, and I thought the skill bugged and selected an adjacent enemy until I realized I'm a fucking idiot and forget to read tooltips. But really, it's not often that an early access game is as polished in terms of fit and finish as this game is. Unfrozen definitely gets points in my book for having released a bug-free product, especially in early access. So to conclude, the bug-free praise is warranted, but the game does have some severe balancing issues that need ironed out. I think the parts system needs to get a revision and even it out across the board, and the variety of some artifact slots need looked at as well. Also, if I'm not crazy and alchemy is as good as I think it is, I think the talent trees could use a heavy dose of change to make the other ones more interesting. A lot of minions and enemies seem way overtuned or way undertuned, but honestly, you can probably just chalk that up to the nature of growing pains in a game like this. The base they've built to this point is solid, and I think given some time and careful planning, they can make this a really great game. But as I suspected early on, there's a lot of work to be done. Even though I'm still pretty pissed off about the paywall minion lockout, and I mean, there are plenty of minions to play, make no mistake, but that's just still, for me, just a bit unforgivable. But I have enjoyed my time with this game, despite some of its shortcomings. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I have no plans to play the game again until it fully releases. As, you know, every time I got cut off after the 3rd level, it was such a major buzzkill, and it makes for a really unfinished, incomplete feeling to the experience overall. And I know, surprise, surprise, an early access game is incomplete. Well, whatever, but I felt obligated to at least mention how I felt when completing this version of the game, because it's not in your face and obvious that the game is missing levels when you go to purchase it. And for a $25 game, I think they should disclose this more clearly. For this reason, I don't think I could recommend buying the game in its current state. I mean, if you're just dying to check it out, fine. You know, it has plenty of content to piss around with, but you're missing 40% of the whole experience in the end. But if you're a fan of the genre, and you see they've released the final 2 levels, don't think twice, just get on board. The game has a lot of potential, and they're clearly headed in the right direction. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the review, and hopefully you learned something today about Iratus, Lord of the Dead. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content and you'd like to see more content like it for other games. And let me know what you thought about the video in the comments or what you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching.
Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky. Bony weather incoming. This is my kind of entertainment. They're budgeting.